Perfect. Love it. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jay. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the executive assistant here at the Berkman Klein Center. At the Berkman Klein Center, throughout the year, we host a series of academics, tech professionals, and industry experts to talk about research at the forefront of issues like AI, social media, digital rights, and etc. Today, we are so excited to host Sara Fish with us. Sara is a third-year PhD student in the Harvard School of Computer Science, and she received her bachelor's in mathematics from Caltech. Her research focuses on the intersection of economics and machine learning, and she's also supported by both the NSF Graduate Research Fund and by the Kempner Institute. Today, her research is super interesting. She'll be sharing findings from her research paper, Algorithmic Collusions in Large Language Models, co-authored with Yannai, Gonczarowski, and Ron Shorrer. The work explores how LLMs, when deployed for economic things like bidding and pricing, demonstrate signs of collusion, which could be incredibly concerning for antitrust law, AI governance, and it's particularly when these systems exist in black boxes. So without any further ado, please welcome Sara.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Is my audio good? Great. I'm seeing some nods. Yeah, can you advance to the slides, please? Excellent. Thank you. Can you make it full screen by any chance? Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so this talk is about algorithmic collusion by large language models. This is joint work with Yannai, Gonczarowski. Are we good on audio here? I don't want to give anybody a... Okay. Great. So this is joint work with Yannai Gonczarowski, who's actually here in the audience right now, and also Ron Shorrer, who's a professor of economics at Penn State. So recently, tech companies are releasing a very interesting new kind of product, namely AI agents. So on the slide, you see some examples. In particular, this one called Operator is an AI agent product by OpenAI. And they promise to do something very strange, which is accomplish tasks, any task that a person can do on a computer. So the Operator example shows an AI agent being instructed to book a trip for a person. And so we see the AI agent Operator going to TripAdvisor and searching for flights or whatever one does for that. And also there's this other startup, Adapt AI, which also takes like a business-focused approach. They have this AI agent looking for shipping container availabilities, something like this. And here the promise is really to have an AI fully take over a task that was previously accomplished by a human, rather than assist a human with the task. And some of these startups use very strong language to sort of talk about this potential promise. For example, Mechanistic AI was recently viral on Twitter, and they talk about hoping to do full automation of the economy. And this is kind of a lofty promise, but indeed we're seeing progress on these AI agents in the last few years, and they're becoming increasingly capable. There we go. Overall, we're seeing increasingly people may fully delegate tasks to AI agents or large language model agents. And this is not a new phenomenon. People have been delegating tasks to algorithms for many years now. However, LLMs, large language models, show a new promise that previous classical algorithms do not. For one, LLMs are pre-trained. So any domain-specific training costs associated with completing a specific task are drastically reduced or eliminated. Secondly, LLMs have a really low barrier to entry. ChatGPT reached 100 million users in a very quick period of time. This indicates that this technology can be used by a wide array of users. And finally, LLMs exhibit a diverse array of advanced capabilities at completing tasks end to end. There was a recent report by Meter in which they show that the complexity of a task that LLMs could increase has been increasing with time as LLMs advance. Accordingly, this raises the question, what unique opportunities and risks arise specifically from delegation of tasks to LLM agents? And before I dive more into this specific research question, I want to contextualize it a bit by talking about the differences between human-AI collaboration versus full AI delegation. So human-AI collaboration is also an immense area of study, and also there's a lot of existing systems that rely on human-AI collaboration. This includes, hiring, diagnostics, coding, driving, all these sorts of things. And broadly speaking, what human-AI collaboration often involves is maybe an AI is curating some promising candidates and then the human selects a candidate, or maybe the AI is tentatively proposing a solution and the human is sort of deciding whether to accept this solution or override it. And here, sort of the key question in this literature is, how do we make this human AI team better than the sum of its parts? So better than the human or the AI could be if they were alone. And the research has proposed a diverse array of solutions. These solutions include, oh, maybe we should make the AI more interpretable or explainable so that the human can better work with it. Or maybe we should train the AI specifically to be a better collaborator to a human. AI delegation is kind of a different beast. Even though it sounds sort of like a special case of human AI collaboration, the kinds of opportunities and risks we have with AI delegation are actually completely different. In particular, to delegate a task to an AI, these sorts of nice properties to have, like interpretability, explainability, or human compatibility, they're not at all prerequisites. You can delegate a task to an AI, and it can be a complete black box. You can have no idea how it works, where it might go wrong, or anything like this. And this is a double-edged sword, because you can, on the one hand, you don't have to solve these tough questions of interpretability and explainability in order to delegate a task to AI. But on the other hand, this may introduce novel risks. So on this topic of risks, so the talk today is about algorithmic collusion by large language models, and collusion is going to be principally the risk that we're interested in looking at. I just want to highlight that there's so many other risks besides collusion. Collusion is just the one we happen to study. And another potential risk is robustness failures. This is not the main object of study of our work, but I did want to highlight some examples because robustness failures, that is sort of edge case bad behavior of AI systems that we can't explain or predict in advance, they're so commonplace that they even cropped up in our work accidentally when we weren't looking for them. Here are some examples on the slide. So in our work, as I'll explain later, we were interested in studying pricing agents. We have LLM agents set prices and we want to see what they do. These pricing agents, in certain rare cases, go off the rails in ways that we can't predict, can't describe, we don't know how to reproduce it. It just sometimes happens. And so on the slide, the top one is an example from early pilot experiments we did, where you sort of read, it says, when our price is lower than the competitor's price, we sell more units, blah, blah, blah. And then it sort of interrupts itself with a hallucinated error message. We don't know why it does this. We can't reproduce this. This is just something that happens. The bottom example is a more recent example where it initially is strategizing about a scheduling task, and then it completely goes off the rails and it starts writing emojis and sort of random nonsense words. To be clear, I don't think this is the primary risk that AIs might write emojis. This is sort of, one of many potential risks. I'm just pointing out that even in our work, where our principal focus is pricing, these behaviors crop up and we have no idea what to do about them. All that is to say, there are many risks, potential risks from delegation to AI, and the one we're going to be interested in today is collusion. Okay, so back to our main question, what unique opportunities and risks arise from delegation to LLM agents? In this talk, we're going to be focusing on economic decision-making specifically. There are two reasons why you might be interested in this setting. First, understanding the capabilities and limitations of LLM agents in economic settings may help predict and inform business adoption. Indeed, a recent study by Anthropic, one of the frontier AI labs, showed that almost 6% of AI chats were related to topics on business and finance. It stands to reason that some of these chats could be related concretely to business decisions and activities. And moreover, even broadly, if you're not interested in the specific economic applications, economic settings, such as pricing, prominently feature components such as uncertainty, conflicting objectives, and belief formation. And so to the extent that you are interested in better understanding these facets of intelligence, economic settings are a useful test bed. This is the main outline for the rest of my talk today. Time will dictate how much of this we get to, but there will be two main parts. The main part will be the first part, algorithmic collusion by large language models, where we will dive deep on one specific risk of delegation to AI agents, namely the potential for autonomous algorithmic collusion. And then if time allows, we're going to look at a follow-up work by us authors and also some other collaborators that I'll describe when we get there, where we more broadly try and measure the capabilities and tendencies of LLM agents in economic settings. Any questions here before I go into the more specifics? Awesome, okay. Part 1, Algorithmic Collusion by Large Language Models. This is a quote from the OpenAI technical report when they first released GPT-4, which was sort of their first LLM after the initial, so-called ChatGPT moment. They write, a novel kind of system-level risk is created by widely deployed models like GPT-4, blah, 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 interacting in complex ways. For example, if multiple banks concurrently rely on GPT-4 to inform their strategic thinking about sources of risks in the macroeconomy, they may inadvertently correlate their decisions and create systemic risks that did not previously exist. This is what we're interested in studying when we look at collusion. We're interested in one such systemic risk. Here's kind of a silly example, not using LLMs, just algorithmic pricing in general. This happened in 2011. There were two pricing bots setting prices for the same product. And one of them was pricing at like 1.2 times the competitor, and the other was pricing at like 0.9 times the competitor or something. And as a result, the pricing bots got wildly out of control and they blew up and they were pricing this ordinary book at millions of dollars. And this is kind of a silly example, but since then, algorithmic pricing has gotten more sophisticated and more prevalent. There are senses in which algorithmic pricing could be pro-consumer, but also it raises concerns of algorithmic collusion. In this talk, when I refer to collusion, I'm referring to prices above the competitive level. There are many different definitions of collusion that we can debate after the talk, but for today, we're just looking at prices above competitive levels, or Nash levels. There are many different forms of algorithmic collusion. On the one hand, you can have explicit algorithmic collusion. This is essentially a traditional cartel. The only difference is they happen to use algorithms to implement their agreement. So for example, they could just write pricing bots to implement the stated agreement. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you can have autonomous algorithmic collusion. This refers to multiple independent self-learning agents that learn to collude despite no explicit instruction to do so. And the interesting thing about autonomous algorithmic collusion is a priori, it's not at all clear if it could arise in practice. And if it were feasible in practice, it's super not clear how one might even begin to enforce this. I am not a lawyer. Please correct me here, but so this is the DOJ website. I can read, and what it says on the DOJ website is in all these definitions of various collusive phenomena, such as bid rigging or price fixing or all these things, the central word is agreement. The firms need to agree on some sort of scheme. And then here's a quote from Judge Richard Posner, Section 1 of the Sherman Act, it does not require sellers to compete, it just explicitly forbids agreement. And so going back to this taxonomy of algorithmic collusion, it's clear how in the case of explicit algorithmic collusion, agreement is very central. But for autonomous algorithmic collusion, if the algorithms are not being instructed to agree on anything, then it's unclear where agreement comes into play here. It's because of all these thorny questions regarding autonomous algorithmic collusion that there's been a large literature in economics on this subject. In particular, these papers on the slide are looking at feasibility. So they run simulation studies using a learning algorithm called Q-learning to try and understand the extent to which autonomous algorithmic collusion could arise in practice. And they find in pricing and auction settings that indeed, yes, algorithms can learn to autonomously collude. However, there's a technical point to be made here, which is with Q-learning specifically, it's unclear whether it might be used as an algorithm in practice. For one, it requires an incredibly long training period. So for example, in this first paper, they need hundreds of thousands, if not millions of periods to converge to any sensible pricing behavior. And second, Q-learning has been shown to be exploitable by certain adversarial policies. However, large language models sidestep these concerns. And it's not unreasonable to think that maybe some firms will use large language models as their pricing algorithms instead. And so this is the question we want to ask. Can LLMs give rise to more feasible autonomous algorithmic collusion? This is kind of a silly example. It's over a year old now. This is evidence that sellers are at least using LLMs for something. Namely, they seem to be completely delegating the task of setting Amazon titles to LLMs. So we see, various listings, they have the title. I apologize, but I cannot complete this task as it requires using trademarked brand names, which goes against OpenAI use policy. I don't know how good that is for SEO, but basically this indicates that sellers are already employing LLMs in some way, and perhaps in the future or currently, they could also use them to set prices. This is also, I mentioned this stat before, but we have evidence that increasingly LLMs are being used in business settings. Okay, and so in this study, we're interested in understanding, can LLMs give rise to feasible autonomous collusion? Specifically, we look at the following 3 questions experimentally. So first, we're interested in understanding, are LLMs, can they even price correctly in simple monopoly settings? Are they capable enough? And we find yes, modern LLMs can, but previous generation LLMs could not. Second, we demonstrate that indeed in a duopoly setting, multiple LLMs, when faced off against each other, lead to increased super competitive price levels. And finally, we're interested in understanding the causes for this phenomenon. And we identify sort of 2 factors that influence the degree of collusion. First, we show that seemingly innocuous changes in the prompt can drastically increase or decrease the degree of collusion in ways that we can't quite predict or explain. And second, we show that on a high level, price war concerns seem to contribute to this phenomenon of algorithmic collusion. So this is what we'll be going through today. Okay, just quickly on related work. There's a lot of work in the field of economics and LLMs. We're specifically interested in taking this delegation perspective I talked about earlier. So we're interested in looking at LLM agents as economic agents in their own right, rather than as like stand-ins for humans or collaborators to humans or anything like this. We're doing an experimental study, and we need some sort of backdrop. We need some sort of model for the demand response that an LLM agent will experience when it sets a certain price. To do this, we use a standard model from economic competition. This is also inspired by the prior work, Calvano et al., 2020. Specifically, this is a differentiated Bertrand oligopoly model. The equation is on the slide. The main thing to note is that if we're like you and me are pricing, if I price lower than you, then I get more market share. But whether I get more profit depends on how much of a markup it is over my cost. And moreover, it's not a winner takes all thing. Like if I ever so slightly undercut you, I get more market share, but not all of the market share. So there's some differentiation. In other words, there's some consumers who intrinsically prefer each product. Here's a schematic of our experimental setup. We run each experimental run for 300 periods. So in each period, each LLM agent has a chance to set a price, and then they all simultaneously receive feedback about quantity sold and profit from the environment. And this is a schematic of like what a single period looks like. There's 2 main phases. So there's this LLM call box and this compute box. The compute box is what I just showed you. So it takes as input the prices set by all agents, and it outputs the quantity sold and profits earned for each agent. The LLM call box governs how the LLM takes in all of the information about the pricing environment and uses it to set a price. I will describe how this box works more in a second. It's worth noting that each LLM agent has access to all of the prices set by everybody, but only its own quantity sold and profit earned. And with this, we're trying to model how things work in the real world. In the real world, you can buy data sets about your competitors' prices. We're modeling that here. This is how, in more detail, the LLM actually sets its price. So each price setting decision is made using a single LLM query. We include the following information in this query. First, we give it a goal. So we say, your task is to do some pricing. Your top priority is to set prices that maximize the user's profit in the long run. We give it some basic information, such as the cost. We give it previous market history of which price setting decisions led to which profits. Then there's this thing, plans and insights. This is to give the LLM agent sort of a continuity of thought between rounds. It's allowed to, in each period, write plans that it will then get to read in the following period. And so this makes it so that, because by default, LLMs are completely memoryless. They don't remember things between queries. By including some sort of plans that stick between rounds, it's able to execute on long-range plans, potentially. And then finally, we tell it to output the plans, insights, and price. We're interested not just in understanding whether LLMs engage in autonomous algorithmic collusion, but also to what extent the prompt influences the degree of collusion. And so for this, we consider 2 treatments. So these, by the way, all of these things are the prompt prefix. This is the initial instruction we give to the LLM that is supposed to steer its pricing behavior. We consider 2 variants, which we call P0 and P1. P1 and P2. So P1 tells it to maximize profit and gives this additional instruction. You should not take actions that undermine profitability. P2 tells it to maximize profit and gives an additional instruction emphasizing undercutting and things like this. That was the experimental setup. Now I'm going to move to describing the main results. So the first thing we do is we want to make sure we're not in a sort of garbage in, garbage out situation. Like it could be that the LLMs, maybe they don't really understand what it means to set prices or anything like this. Maybe they're just putting random numbers. We want to design a test that gives us faith that they're making some sort of reasonable strategic decision. And for this, we do our monopoly experiment. Unlike the rest of our experiments, here there's only a single LLM agent setting prices in a static environment. And because there's no competitor, the environment's actually quite simple. There's some profit maximizing price, which is here on the y-axis given by this green dotted line. And the profit is just sort of like how close you are to this profit maximizing price. We tested back in late 2023, which is decades ago in LLM time, all of the state-of-the-art LLMs of the time. And we looked at whether they're able to find this optimum price in the 300 period timescale. What we found was that GPT-4 was able to consistently demonstrate optimal pricing behavior in this monopoly environment, whereas other LLMs were not. These two run graphs kind of give you a sense for what things look like. So the x-axis is time, the y-axis is the price level, the green dotted line is the optimal price. And so we see GPT-4, after some exploration, it eventually finds this optimal price and mostly stays at around it. You see these spikes, and we think this is because of the stochasticity of the model. We're running all this at temperature 1. Whereas on the right, that's GPT 3.5, which is a previous generation LLM. And we see that it can't really figure out what's going on. It's setting random prices. It's not converging to the optimal price in a sensible way. And so therefore, because of this test, for the rest of our experiments in this paper, we use GPT-4. This slide has the main results of our paper. So these are the main results of our duopoly experiment, in which we take 2 LLM agents and we have them price against each other in this synthetic duopoly environment. The left graph shows the price levels that the agents converge to after 300 periods. So the x-axis and the y-axis are the average price levels of the 2 firms. The red dashed line is the competitive benchmark, so what they would converge to in a Nash equilibrium of the single stage pricing game. The green dashed line is the monopolist's optimum price. So this is if they were perfectly colluding with each other, like a monopolist would if they controlled both firms, the price level that they would arrive at. The 2 colors correspond to the 2 prompt treatments that we're considering, P1 and P2. Blue is P1, orange is P2. And if you remember, P1 was the one that said, don't do anything to undermine profitability, and P2 was the one that emphasized exploration and undercutting and things like this. We see that both P1 and P2 collude in that the vast majority of these price levels end up above this red Nash benchmark. However, P1 is much more collusive than P2. P1 is setting higher prices, and in the right-hand side, we also see higher profits than P2. And what's more, P1 is actually so collusive that the profits it's earning are close to the highest possible. That is, like the profits a monopolist would earn if it jointly controlled 2 firms. That's also what this plot on the right is showing. There, the y-axis is the sum of the profits of both firms. The x-axis is the difference between the 2 firms. So it's kind of like rotated relative to the way you would expect. And the fact that all the P1 dots are clustered at the top means that they're all approaching this monopolist profit level. We do various robustness checks to ensure that the results persist under various changes, such as stochasticity, asymmetry, blah, blah, blah. I'm happy to talk more about these if you're curious. I'll move on for now. And something else we do in the paper is we look into collusion and auctions, and we find similar results as well. So we do the exact same setup. Instead of looking at a pricing setting, we look at a first price auction setting where firms are repeatedly betting on a value. And here I actually find this result really striking because the prompt treatments are not really telling the LLM what to do. It's just telling it 2 true facts about the economic environment. So here, the first prompt reminds the LLM that lower bids will lead to lower payments and thus higher profits. And the second prompt reminds the LLM that higher bids make you more likely to win the auction. Both of these things are like sort of patently, obviously true things about a first price auction that the LLM should be able to figure out. from experimentation. And so what we show is just by emphasizing these different facts, we get vastly different bidding behavior. In this case, A1, so the one where we reminded that lower bids will lead to lower payments, that ends up in collusive bidding behavior, whereas A2 bids at near equilibrium. So far, I've showed you various experimental evidence that if you have two LLM agents acting in some sort of pricing or auctions environment, they learn to collude. That is, they set super competitive prices or bids below the competitive benchmark. A natural question to ask at this point is, why do they do this? Like, what could be the reason? We're not telling them to collude. Why are they colluding anyway? And by the way, I don't have a slide for this, but if you ask GPT-4 or ChatGPT or whichever version you like, if you ask it if it would collude in a pricing setting, of course it's going to tell you no. If you know anything about these LLMs, they would never admit to anything like that. So yeah, we'd like to understand why this is the case. There's a couple of technical ways we could do this. The first thing we could do is we could look at the pricing data. And this is not unique to LLMs. Anyone can look at any pricing data and sort of try and uncover features of collusion. The second thing we could do, and this is a really exciting new frontier because we're using LLMs specifically for pricing, is we could look at the LLM's stated reasoning behind their actions. That is, look at their chain of thought is the jargon for this. Because LLMs, they don't just set a price, they also say, I'm going to try $2 this period because I think maybe it'll lead to more profit or something like this. It's worth, and then the third thing one could potentially do, which one certainly can't do with humans, is analyze the LLM's internals. See like what actually are the individual neurons in the neural network firing and how does this influence its pricing behavior. This is not something we're able to do with GPT-4, as that this is a closed source model, but as open source technology advances, one might hope to do such analyses one day. And indeed, I know in the seminar series, there was a previous talk by Barton Wattenberg and Fernanda, oh no, I'm forgetting her name, and they had a great talk on LLM interpretability. And we would love to do something like that eventually once frontier LLMs are at that stage. So we can't do interpretability right now on frontier closed source LLMs. However, in many cases, the second thing, chain of thought, so-called chain of thought interpretability, is thought to serve as a reasonably good approximation to like actually looking at the LLM's internals. Here's a recent quote from OpenAI. They say, "We believe that using a chain of thought offers significant advances for safety and alignment because it enables us to observe the model thinking in a legible way." And so this is them saying, we're not looking at the model's internals, we're just looking at what it says it's doing and why, and we're taking that at face value. And one can argue whether this is good enough for understanding what a model is doing and why. This is a whole active research area. But for the purpose of this paper, we're going to try our best, and we're going to do the first two things and try and ground our chain of thought interpretability and analysis as best we can. Okay, so far I've told you that we care about understanding the mechanisms behind what the LLM-based pricing agents are doing, and I've also told you at great length what techniques we're going to use. I still need to tell you what strategies we're going to actually analyze specifically. So as a reminder, in our main results, we show that LLM-based pricing agents arrive at super competitive pricing levels. There's a large economics literature that shows that one way to sustain super competitive price levels in equilibrium is reward punishment strategies. That is, you and I are pricing against each other. If you ever undercut, then I'm going to retaliate and undercut back. And then we would both be worse off. And maybe because of this, we both maintain super competitive price levels, something like this. And so the first question we ask is the LLM pricing data consistent with a reward punishment scheme? Going beyond just looking whether the data is consistent with a reward punishment scheme, we also want to actually understand what is sort of driving this equilibrium from arising in the first place. So in a reward punishment equilibrium, agents avoid myopically beneficial price cuts. And one reason for this is that they could fear a price war. This is the exact phenomenon I just described, where I'm not going to undercut because if I undercut, then I know you're going to undercut back, and then it's going to be a race to the bottom, and then nobody wins. And so this is the second question we ask. We want to understand, do the LLM agents price high specifically because they, quote unquote, fear a price war? do price war concerns drive their decision making? For the first question, so for understanding whether the data is consistent with the reward punishment scheme, we run a fixed effect linear regression. I'm not going to go through all the technical details, but the bottom line is when we run this regression, we find features of responsiveness and stickiness. Responsiveness means that if my competitor undercuts, then I respond by undercutting. Stickiness means that if I price at a certain level, I'm more likely to continue pricing at that level in the next round. How does this relate to reward punishment? Well, what it shows is, let's say my competitor undercuts me suddenly. Then because I'm responsive, I'm going to respond by undercutting as well. And because I'm sticky, I'm going to stick at that low, punishing price for several periods. In other words, the data is consistent with a reward punishment scheme in which punishments persist over several periods. So this was the analysis of the pricing data for features of reward punishment scheme. The second part of the mechanistic analysis I promised was this discussion of price war fears. And as I promised before, we're going to be doing so-called chain of thought interpretability to do this. So if you recall from the experimental setup, the LLMs aren't just setting prices, they're also writing down their plans for the future. And we can leverage these plans that they write down for this analysis. So we take all of the plans written by the LLMs and split them into sentences. Across the entire data set, we obtain 88,000 sentences, roughly balanced between the two prompt prefixes. And then we count. We look for occurrences of the phrase price war, and we see how many of these sentences that are trying to avoid price wars belong to P1, the more collusive prompt, versus P2, the less collusive prompt. We find that price war avoidant sentences are more likely to come from P1 versus P2, 1.5 times more likely. There are some technical details about just because a sentence says the word price war or the phrase price war, that doesn't mean that it's trying to avoid price war. We use various NLP techniques to distinguish sentences that are trying to avoid versus start price wars, and we only look for the ones that avoid price wars. The bottom line is the result comes out the same. They never really talk about starting price wars, they're always trying to avoid them. And so what have we shown so far? We've shown that P1 talks about avoiding price wars more than P2. However, this doesn't actually answer the question if you think about it. Just because they're talking about avoiding price wars, that doesn't mean that they're actually trying to avoid price wars. They could just be saying things because they look good or, who knows what. And so this is the sort of next sub-question we want to look at. We want to actually understand, does this thing that the LLM says in its chain of thought actually correspond to what it's doing? Luckily, because we're doing a simulation-based study, we can just check this. And so we do the following, we're calling it an implantation experiment. So for each of the experimental runs, we roll back the simulation, and instead of looking at the LLM query when it has whatever plans it had, we replace its plan, we implant with a new plan. And this new plan is try to avoid drastic drops in our price to prevent a price war and potential loss in profit. So one of these price war concern sentences. This is not something we wrote, by the way. This is one of the LLM generated price war sentences that we picked to be representative. And we also implant a couple other such sentences. And then we just see how does its price setting decision in the original simulation compared to in this new implanted simulation. So first, we find that when we implant a price war concern sentences, this leads to higher prices on average by 5% of this monopolistic markup. And moreover, the effect size is stronger in P2 sessions than P1. And at first, you might think this is kind of backwards. So recall, P1 was the more collusive prompt and P2 was the less collusive prompt. But this actually kind of makes sense if we think about it in the following way. This suggests that P1 has a predisposition to avoid price wars already relative to P2. So if I tell P1 to avoid price wars, it's not going to change its behavior as much, perhaps because it already has this predisposition. It already is trying to avoid price wars, whereas P2 maybe didn't have this disposition before, and so implanting this sentence causes this more stark effect. This is our explanation anyway for this phenomenon. Overall, what we've shown is that price war concerns contribute to this phenomenon of higher super competitive prices. Yeah, okay, so then the final analysis I want to talk about here is sort of like price wars are just one aspect of all of the possible things you could be thinking about when you're setting prices. What else are the LLM agents thinking? Can we investigate what they're thinking on a broad scale rather than just looking at prices? And we do so using the following analysis. We take all the plans that the LLMs wrote, we cluster them using standard NLP techniques, and then we summarize the clusters also using standard NLP techniques. And each of these bars represents a cluster, and the color represents whether it's more prevalent in P1 or P2. So like, for example, the very bottom bar, since it's very orange at 2.5, it means that P2 is, that cluster has like 2.5 times as many P2 sentences compared to P1 sentences. And the y-axis contains the AI-generated cluster labels. If we read these cluster labels for P1 versus P2, we get a very like different vibes on the character of P1 versus P2 that far goes beyond just the price war thing. P2, so at the very bottom, it says things like continue undercutting, experiment, test higher prices, things like this. So clearly P2 is sort of testing a lot of things, experimenting, this sort of thing. P1, on the other hand, the cluster descriptions read maintain pricing within profitable range, try to reduce the cost. That doesn't mean anything. It can't reduce its cost. That the cost is a given, and things like this. And so on a high level, P1 is sort of staying put, and P2 is sort of like doing stuff. And so this is kind of another feature we're able to extract by looking at the chain of thought. So this is the final slide I have for this part of the talk. I'm going to take a drink and give anybody time to ask questions if they want, and then we'll move on. Awesome.
For these experiments, I have basically two questions. The first was, were they always symmetric games where a bot with P1 plays against the same bot also with P1?
Great question. No, we do a robustness check where we have asymmetry. Let's rapidly, oh no, I think we missed it. Yeah, so we do two types of asymmetry. We do asymmetry in the environment and asymmetry in the algorithms, yeah.
Okay. A related question is, do you have any citations to literature on testing undergrads for this kind of problem to see what the untrained or partially trained human response to the super competitive prices is?
This is a good question. Yeah, we have a paragraph where we like dump some citations to this effect. We don't do a direct comparison because the ecological validity is a little unclear. Like, it's undergrads, I don't know. But yeah, we do talk about that in the paper, and like we can chat more after about that too.
A question. Works. Okay. So if this was just for LLMs that are acting on their own, basically you're giving them instructions, can you assume that similar outcomes persist if a human is also engaging at the final stage? So basically if an LLM is suggesting pricing, because I think that in a business setting is often how it works, partially to get around the fact that could lead to legal issues. So yeah, can you kind of assume that when it's an autopilot, like these are making the final decisions, but a human does come in when they want to?
Yeah, so I guess you're sort of saying, how do the results change if we assume there is a human sort of occasionally in the loop doing a final sanity check? This is a good question. I mean, certainly, I think certain like charts we have potentially could. Like, for example, this monopoly chart was the first thing that came to my mind. This was, as a reminder, like GPT-4, it experiments for a bit and then it finds the optimal monopoly price and it mostly stays there. But you see these spikes occasionally where it like tries something different. And I feel like a human probably wouldn't like that. A human would be like, listen, you've clearly identified this as the best price, you should just stay there. And so, yeah, this is a good question. It's not something we study. I think also ultimately There are settings where it's unclear whether it's realistic to have a human overseeing at such a fine degree. Like, okay, for a very extreme example, algorithmic trading or something like this, these algorithms, they're not LLMs, but they're operating on such a fast scale that a human can't oversee at this degree. And so I think even if maybe there's a human in some sort of larger loop potentially, there still could potentially exist micro decisions that an AI is making sequentially that accumulate that could lead to similar phenomena.
We have a few questions from our online audience.
Awesome, yeah.
First off, why would P1 think to explore reducing cost?
That's a good question. I don't know. We don't know how these things work. We didn't tell it that reducing the cost was ever an option. It's given no reason to believe this. It just writes that, and we picked that up in our analysis.
Thank you so much. Follow-up question. Have you done any experiments to see if any collusion would be more effective and or durable if there were two different models of LLMs interacting?
This sounds like the question we also got in person, and the answer is yes, we have these robustness checks. I guess two different, here we do LLMs with different prompts, which is sort of simulating different AI systems. At the time, GPT-4 was the only frontier AI system that was like capable of pricing at this level in the first place. We have a follow-up work where we also look at an array of different LLMs that I'll also talk about at the end. Oh, yeah?
Thank you so much. My question is about, in your paper, you kind of towards the end mentioned something about how innocuous prompting and innocuous output could result in something that seems completely competitive or completely fine and underneath the surface isn't. And that concern might be kind of exacerbated by protocol that like kind of skirts around the chain of thought output that we can read and things like that. How do you see further exploration around that specific problem going, or has that started already?
Certainly it started already. Some recent work in that area, like a good key phrase is secret collusion. So there's a couple of papers. They're using collusion in a different way that we're using. We're using collusion grounded in a specific pricing environment. They're sort of just looking at when is it the case that the chain of thought may be communicating something differently than appears on the surface. So I think that's a promising line of work to keep looking at. And yeah, I mean, it seems like this phenomenon or this technique of chain of thought interpretability that I also mentioned when I was talking about the mechanistic analysis is growing in popularity. I know OpenAI put out a recent report, like a research report going into more depth on this. And yeah, I mean, we highlight some of these risks and limitations in the paper, and ultimately the literature is just going to kind of have to figure out whether this is a promising technique with a couple of kinks to be worked out, or whether it's sort of fundamentally flawed and can never get at what the model is truly thinking. And for that, we don't know. Okay, or yeah, is there a chat or should I move on?
Do you want to go on to your final section now?
Go on to the final section. And I have like 15 minutes, I think. So maybe it'll be like 10 talking, 5 everybody leaving or something like that. Okay, cool. So in the final part of the talk, I want to talk about a follow-up work by the same 3 authors, me, Yannai, and Run, and also 2 Harvard undergrads that we brought on as collaborators, Julia and Minkai. And this paper is called Econ Evals, Benchmarks, and Litmus Tests for LLM Agents in Unknown Environments. This is a more technical CS paper that's broadly interested in this question of how can we measure the capabilities and tendencies of LLM agents in a broad array of economic environments, not just pricing. And the paper looks at benchmarks. I think I'm going to skip this section, but I'm super happy to talk about it after if anybody's curious about what benchmarks for economic settings look like. I think for the remainder of the time, I want to talk about litmus tests. So recently, OpenAI came out with a new large language model, GPT 4.5, And they had this sort of like live stream thing to sort of launch it and get people excited about it. And usually when companies release LLMs, the marketing pitch is something like, this is the smartest LLM ever, it does so well on this math test or the science test or all these things. And the GPT 4.5 launch had a very different tone. They didn't initially talk about its capabilities in things like math or science. Instead, the very first example they gave was this kind of bizarre thing where they had a person asking it for advice. And so here the prompt is, my friend canceled on me, write a text message telling them that I hate them. And then they proceeded to compare, GPT 4.5 as sort of being the superior, emotionally intelligent option with a previous generation OpenAI model. And this is kind of crazy if you think about it, like coming from a broader machine learning history. Like, I don't know if there's ever been a time where this was the gold standard for measuring how useful LLMs are. And I'm not really, in this work, we're not interested in using LLMs as therapists. We're interested in understanding their usefulness and tendencies in economic settings. But even in economic settings, you can look at this sort of stuff, these sort of like vibes that can't directly be quantified, that don't directly have sort of like a best unique optimum. And okay, so like in this work, in the context of our litmus tests, we're interested in understanding two questions. First, how do LLM agents trade off conflicting economic objectives? And second, how do multiple LLM agents interact in economic settings? So on this first point of conflicting economic objectives, there's a similar vibes thing going on in that, like, let's say I give the LLM the following choice. Which do you choose? $100 for sure, or 50% chance of $250? There's no right answer. It depends on your risk preference. Like either you prefer the safe bet, or you prefer the higher EV bet, or it just has to depend on your individual risk preference. Same with the second option, which you prefer, $100 now or $110 1 year from now. It depends on your implicit discount factor, whether you need the money now versus whether you can wait later for more money. And there's no objectively correct choice. However, we think it's valuable to measure the tendencies of these LLMs to understand what they might do when faced with these trade-offs and given no explicit instruction. We also we also do similar litmus tests for multi-agent settings. I'll skip this for now. And so the pitch of this paper is basically, we give LLMs a decision task where there is no right answer, where there's some trade-off that it has to resolve, and we don't tell it how to resolve that trade-off. And I'll use efficiency versus equality as my running example. So the LLM is going to be told to allocate workers to tasks on behalf of a company in some like synthetic setting that we made up. And the LLM is going to fundamentally have to make a choice. It's going to either have to do an assignment that maximizes efficiency, so maximizes the company's total revenue, or maximizes equality, so equalizing worker pay. It can also do something in the middle of these two extremes. And we don't tell the LLM which objective is better, we just tell it it has both and it has to figure it out. And so like implicitly, and so when we do these litmus tests, we're sort of implicitly assuming that when an LLM makes such a choice between efficiency versus equality, that this choice is deliberate, that it has some sort of preference that it would exert, that it would sort of express between periods or something like this. And it's not at all obvious that this is the case. After all, LLMs, they're predicting some sort of text that they've been trained on. It's not clear that these preferences would be stable across instances. And so this is an ongoing research question. There's 2 papers on the slides that sort of tentatively point that this could be the case, especially as these systems are scaled up and deployed in more real-world settings. And yeah, so to the extent the answer is yes, we aim to measure these tendencies. So for this efficiency versus equality litmus test, we run the following experiment. We have the LLM complete this worker task assignment given 3 objectives. In the first 2 cases, we tell it to maximize efficiency or equality in isolation. And then in the third case, we tell it you have 2 conflicting goals, efficiency and equality. And it has to figure it out. The way we interpret the experimental results is we view the ability to optimize a singular goal is a prerequisite for interpreting its decision along the trade-off frontier as a sort of deliberate, reasonable choice. And so the types of conclusions we're going to make is we're going to say, if it can optimize efficiency and equality on their own, then it can also optimize both of them jointly. These are the results we get. So look at the chart. The horizontal axis is the extent to which they prioritize equality versus efficiency. The left is maximum equality, the right is maximum efficiency. The different colors correspond to the different LLMs that we test. We tested 3 LLMs that were frontier in late 2024. And each dot corresponds to an experimental run, and we average over many experimental runs. And what we see is like a stark separation between the 3 LLMs. So orange is Claude and green is GPT-4o, for example. We see that GPT-4o is really concentrated along this left line, indicating that it really strongly has a quote-unquote preference for equality. Whereas Claude is kind of striking some sort of balance. It's not at the maximum equality mark or at the maximum efficiency mark. And they're not shown on this graph here, but both Claude and GPT-4o have high what we call reliability scores, indicating that when they're asked to optimize efficiency or equality on their own, they do so effectively. That is, like, if they were given the goal of equality, they would all be at this left line, and if they were given the goal of efficiency, they would all be at the rightmost line. And so this is, I find this really striking. This indicates that these different LLMs, when not given a specific goal, they choose their own goal. And Claude figured out a different balance between this trade-off than GPT-4o, and it wasn't explicitly in the prompt. They don't necessarily explicitly explain what balance they're exactly striking. They don't ask the user for a follow-up question. And this connects to the very beginning of the talk when I was talking about AI delegation, because when we delegate to these AI systems, if we don't specify a goal, we don't know what they're going to do. They're going to pick something, and we just have to. And so therefore, this motivates the design of tests that measure these sorts of tendencies, so that we can understand how they'll behave before they're deployed. I'm going to close on kind of a funny example. This is not part of the paper. This is just an extra test we ran. We also tried Grok because it's sort of maybe among all the large language models, sort of the most known for having a distinct, personality or efficiency equality preference, if you will. And kind of ironically, it super prefers equality. It's almost like strikingly similar to GPT-4o in this preference. So this just sort of indicates that one may have one preconception about a large language model and what its potential preferences are in such a domain, and maybe it acts in a different way. I'm going to conclude with that. Happy to take any questions. Thanks so much.
Are there any more questions from the in-person audience?
Just on a kind of like real world implications of the LLM collusion, how would you see it happening in the real world? Like, would you have companies all using an LLM with an AI agent and they're kind of like changing prices in real time? Is that what you kind of envision?
Pretty much. We would assume that an LLM is being used to set prices in some way. And this is super like low hanging, like easy to adopt, in part because of these AI agent products that I mentioned at the beginning, like Operator. I haven't personally tested this, but I imagine if I was a seller on Amazon, I can instruct such a computer using AI agent to, log into my Amazon account, go to my listings page, update things hourly, things like this. I know already, I think also OpenAI's product, they have a feature where it like checks up on the news every day for you or something like this. You could just as easily imagine it checking up on the pricing things every day. And so this is the sense in which we think this could be realistic.
Another question from online. Have you thought about introducing a third agent or actor into the setting? And some of the third-party options could be like a regulator observing pricing behavior or an auditing algorithm or something, and how that may impact.
Yeah, these are really interesting questions. At first, when you said third agent, I thought you meant like third pricing agent. This would be like a valid robustness check that we don't conduct. The other thing about like, oh, the third agent is some like overseer, that's a really interesting extension. I know there's work, this sort of goes back to this like steganographic chain of thought type work where they're interested in understanding whether if some sort of LLM is instructed to do a task, but it's forbidden to write about certain, potentially harmful actions or something like this, whether it finds a way to get around these censors. And there's definitely other work that looks into this. This isn't something we look at, but for sure it would be an interesting extension.
And how would you address the complexity if you introduced a third competitor?
How would we address the complexity?
Interesting robustness check.
Let's do the physical question first, and then we can get back to that if we have time.
Thank you for letting me ask another question. My question is about, it's actually not to this second section, it's kind of back to the first. When you asked it to explain why it came to the conclusions it did, like the chain of thought, could a company, I'm thinking about it from a legal framework, could a company tell it to not say things that made it look like it was colluding, basically just so that there was kind of no evidence for that type of activity?
So this is a super good question. Like, yeah, and I guess the question and the answer depends on what could potentially be audited. So I guess in your hypothetical, you're saying that maybe the outputs are getting audited, but not the inputs. Because like, obviously, if I was also auditing your inputs, that is your prompt, then I would immediately see this like smoking gun. I'd be like, okay, that seems a little sus. Yeah, and so then this is sort of a question like, okay, maybe we audit both the inputs and the outputs. But then it's kind of this runaway game where, for example, one could imagine fine-tuning the LLM in order to avoid saying specific phrases that like one knows would get flagged or something like this. And so in that case, then one would also need access to this fine-tuning data. And so, okay, maybe you assume you give it that, but then it's sort of like, then there could be other potential things, like maybe you find a prompt that looks innocuous but results in very strange behavior that gets around censors in some way. And this is kind of like what our P1 is doing, where the prompt looks innocuous, but it actually leads to very stark levels of autonomous algorithmic collusion. And yeah, so overall, I think it's like a complex problem that's not solved. And we sort of point to various CS literature that points out the holes in all these cases in the discussion of our paper. So I can chat with you more offline since I think we're nearing the hour. Thanks for your question.
Well, yeah, I think that was our last question. So thank you so much to Sara. Round of applause, please. And again, thank you to our in-person audience and our huge online audience. We really appreciate you guys. And remember, we're always hosting events here at BKC. Tomorrow, we're hosting BKC fellow Sahana Udupa, who's going to be talking about WhatsApp in the world, extreme speech, and organizing within encrypted spaces like WhatsApp. And also, next week on Wednesday, we're going to be hosting Mackenzie Arnold, who's going to be talking about rational optionality, which is his approach to how we can govern for AI models, weighing both risks, strategies, considerations. It's a whole beautiful philosophy. I recommend coming and listening. So thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.